Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is numerically significant episode 100.
Yes.
And the topic is TBAC the next big thing? And we're honored to have guest Eve Mailer today. Welcome, Eve.
Pleasure to be here again.
Quick bit of housekeeping. I just want to ask people who are having fun following the live stream to support the live stream by following it on LinkedIn. And, before normally we do intros, but Eve, you've already been a guest on episode 33. So I'm just going to I reference that in the episode wiki. I think a lot of people already know you. If you don't know Eve, go to episode 33, and that'll give us like an extra couple of seconds to just dive into it. Although Eve, maybe before we do that, you want to say a couple of words about Venn Factory, because I don't know if that was in our last episode.
I don't think it might have existed back then if it was over 5 quarters ago. Venn Factory is my consultancy, and we like to say we develop irresistible identity strategies. So I work with a lot of tech vendors, research firms, enterprises, and individuals to do just that.
Cool. Okay. And, I was flattering you by saying no one is more sort of experienced in authorization than you are. So this is a topic I wanted to have with you. I think we actually talked at, we did that event around South by.
Yep.
So this is, I guess, a follow-up for that. I had this idea for token-based access control. And, my core idea is that when you make an authorization request, you want to send a bundle of tokens. Instead of saying it's this person or this workload, you send a bundle of tokens and you say, should I be allowed to do this action on this resource with this context, given this bundle of tokens that I'm presenting? And that was sort of the heart of the idea. And so today I thought it might be fun to do a top 10 reasons why I think TBAC might make sense. Does that sound good?
It sounds great. And I just say you definitely did flatter me because I think you are the world's foremost expert in TBAC. So it's appropriate that you're presenting this. And I can't possibly know as much as you because it's a new frame for what sounds to me like a great concept. So yeah, let's do the top 10.
I'm definitely the first. Although, one thing that's given me comfort is though I might have like coined this new jargon, but I feel like there's a lot of support from the last 20 years where we've been using tokens for access control and effectively doing this. And so I feel like I'm just formalizing something that really we've been all doing anyway.
That's what I want to pick on today is like, well, where are there the barriers to sort of doing it right? Because like sometimes something comes along that's I think of it as a blinding flash of the obvious, like, oh, it was right there all the time. But now how do we, sort of live up to the potential? So yeah, let's explore it.
That's a good way to describe it. Okay, I'm going to do something. We're going off script today. I'm removing the hat because I feel like I'm pseudo presenting, not moderating. So I'm going native guest, and I prepared slides, which is something we also don't allow on episodes. So we're going completely off script.
If anybody can break the rules, Mike, it's you. So.
So here's my top 10. Oh, let me get rid of the caption. Hold on. So top 10 reasons for TBAC. I want to start with a Venn diagram since you are the founder of Venn Factory. This is my Venn diagram. It's probably not nearly as beautiful in terms of color choice as your Venn diagrams.
I like them all.
But, I made this workload one gray because workloads are so boring. That was my theory. So I was like, okay, workloads. But what I was trying to show in this diagram is that actually, when you think about the policies, we've been really focused on policies about people. Because in our military sort of frame, we're like, who has access to what, and that who's always a person, and we want accountability. Accountability means a person. Somebody's ultimately responsible. So I feel like we've been very person-oriented in our view. Organizational policies, I've actually had two guests recently who were talking about iShare. which is a framework in Europe that they use to for ecosystems to collaborate on sharing data. For example, if you want to know the carbon emissions in across the whole aerospace industry, you need aerospace companies to collaborate and share data about their flights. So they've been setting up these organizational trusts. We've also seen in the education space, remember there's InCommon or EduGain or EduCause. No,
Mm-hmm.
EduGain. Yeah.
Yep.
So, but those are small and nichey. Not many people know about that. That's like really kind of like geeky, but there are a lot of important organizational policies. But I see the biggest area where we're going to have the most policies is actually workload, because the AI agents and the pieces of software acting on our behalf are going to outnumber the humans in the organizations. So, quick thoughts on like this sort of view of it?
Yeah. One of the things I was brainstorming as we prepared to meet here today was, well, what is kind of iconoclastic or brain breaking about TBAC, even if it seems so intuitive, and de-emphasizing human identity centricity and what the subject semantic is all about, to me, is very appealing for the reason that you illustrate so nicely here, also for reasons of being able to get more dynamic and fine-grained that we say we always want to do. So like zero trust, everybody in identity was kind of excited when the zero trust architecture came out and identity was the first pillar. And what they
I'm
mean
so
is,
excited about zero trust actually. So
I mean, that's the thing. It's like, it seems like it's sort of maybe contrary to zero trust because of that who word out of the, whatever, 5 Ws of policy. John Kindervag calls it the Kipling method. Um, so humans are really important, and they're kind of the tip of the spear, so to speak. But we're surrounded by entities with identities, and so I actually think that de-emphasizing the centricity of humans is a great place to start from in getting more adaptable and dynamic. So it's sort of superficially challenging to zero trust, but I actually think it underpins it in a deep fashion.
yeah, in fact, yeah, I'm still I think this approach enables us to implement zero trust. In some way, this parallel I make. Remember, like, there's the heliocentric view of the world where
Yes.
um, versus the Earth-centric view of the
Yes.
world. I forget what that was called. And I feel like we've been stuck in this old world where we're like, no, we're the most important thing, and we sort of have to step outside of that and be like, okay, now clearly there's more AI agents than people. So
So
okay,
this is
maybe
Galileo levels of being saying something outre. Yeah.
I had another thought about the importance or the value of the transactions as those circles get smaller. Maybe the values of the transactions get higher. So, like the workloads maybe are making lots of low value transactions. The people then more valuable. The organizations even more valuable still. So maybe the number of policies versus the value. Maybe there is still more value in the person organization than this diagram shows. But then I don't know
Yeah.
about that because workloads also can do valuable stuff.
I think in general, I mean, that was another thing that I was thinking was this model seems to be able to better support more transient or ephemeral authentication and interactions and transactions. There was recently a blog post from the Cloud Security Alliance, this is only a couple weeks ago, on what's needed for an agentic AI
Hmm.
identity management approach. And the list of requirements, I'll put the link maybe in the chat and put them in show notes, whatever. The
Yeah.
list of requirements for doing this looks like what you're talking about doing, context-aware authentication, continuous authorization, adaptive security policies, and trust scoring mechanisms. Because like the dirty little secret of zero trust thinking, even zero standing privilege thinking is, at some point you're not able to, uh, you have to extend trust. And honestly, our methods of securing resources and doing access control today are like, we don't admit that they're heuristic, but they are. Like overprivileging is a thing. So we're not very close ourselves today to achieving these finer grained methods of testing. So I do believe that you know, token-based thinking allows for anything to be represented in a token. And that means any entity, and maybe we'll start having more entities that can have identities that can be tracked, about which there's data to be known and added to the context. So like maybe context is a better word than subject overall. It
Yeah,
already appears in like things like authzen, but maybe
that's
it's the main
interesting.
thing.
Actually, you're going into issue number one.
Sorry.
My point number. No, that's perfect. Yeah, and this was kind of vague, but just tokens can model the world. Like you're right, we could have workload tokens. And when I talked to Spiral about Spiffy, and they're very clear, we're helping build workload identity, not authorization. But we have workload identity, we have person identity, we have organizational identity through federations. But yeah, maybe we have agentic AI identity,
For
and
sure. I
yeah,
mean, we already have client app identity, and a lot of folks will say, and I tend to agree that for starters, an AI agent is going to be one of those, but it may have some special metadata that you need to know for enough context to make an access decision, right?
authenticator, or maybe this is another point, is that tokens can also represent maybe things that don't have an identity but that have properties. Like I have an authenticator. For privacy reasons, I don't want you to correlate it, so I'm not even going to convey an authenticator. But in a trusted way, I need to convey to you that this is a device-bound private key.
Hmm.
So attestations are JWTs or tokens, and so we can use tokens to convey really interesting new information. Transaction tokens are another example. There's no identity there. That transaction token actually describes. Let's take the example they always use: buy 100 shares of Microsoft at market value, right?
Hmm.
That might be tied to identities, but that's something that we had really trouble modeling in the past. But now we can sort of use tokens to provide a container to model that new kind of information.
So I'm pretty sure there's going to be several folks watching this who are thinking, well, the obvious thing to include in this token universe is verifiable credentials, which are trying to do that. Have you thought through implications of verifiable credentials as part of the bag of tokens?
Yeah, and so we didn't define tokens here. I did that in the TBAC article right up front. So isn't a verifiable credential just a token, really? If it comes as a JWT, a signed JWT, I'm
I mean, I
using
think so.
tokens pretty broadly here. I actually also want to say that I include X509 certificates. It's just a different way to sign a piece of data,
And
and it's
SAML assertions, right?
and SAML assertions, right?
Yep.
As the co-inventor of XML and co-inventor of SAML. Um, so yeah, no, SAML tokens are definitely in there, and I think they actually really help me explain to people when I say, well, what if it's a SAML token? You're already doing that today. It helps people
Yeah.
understand.
And
Um,
anytime you're like anything that's susceptible to token exchange and transformation, which is a lot of things, even if it didn't start as something that starts with T, like, if it started as an assertion and you were
mhm.
changing XML to JSON or whatever, like, yeah, I think this could be quite broad. And I like the idea of having it represent transactional things that are not, well, that you do your best not to make correlatable. That's quite a pernicious problem, actually.
Yeah, well, I think the wallet ecosystem is driving a lot of really important innovation. Revocation, for example, wouldn't exist without wallets. So I think that they're just taking this technology and using it for even more complicated use cases. Like talk to Christina Yasuda, and you
That's
can see
fair.
quickly how complicated it
Yeah.
gets.
I mean,
Um,
revocation is hard, no lie, right? So there's ways to expire, there's ways to have a token time to live strategy. And by the way, I think that TTL strategy becomes extra important to coordinate if you've got. We need a word for a bag of tokens. Like, I don't know. When I was at ForgeRock, colleague of mine, David Luna, and I were trying to get wallets known as a bag of holding. So I don't know if that's going to stick, but maybe we need a bag of holding for tokens.
yeah, yeah, I say a bundle of tokens. All right, let's go to number two. I don't know if we're going to be able to get through all these. If not, the slides
That's
are
fine.
up on the wiki page. So This one's really interesting, but the edge is really important because, I strongly believe that we need the more better decision making at the edge, and this goes to zero trust also.
Yeah.
Um, if I'm a U.S. soldier and I go to an army base in Australia and I present my CAC card, right? That's the edge of the network, and they can validate that token, they can check revocation, and they can let me in or not. Um, so there's your edge. But today the edge is like the mobile phone application or the browser is one edge, and the other edge which is like the data layer. Um, and we need and tokens enable decision making that can be trusted because they enable us to transfer that trust all the way to the edge.
You're still going to have challenges. This is a challenge to be solved, and it's not it's a challenge that we have today, but we're going to have it kind of squared, is that question of caching and freshness and um all of that time to live strategy stuff. And if you
Yeah.
have the opportunity to have revocation in there, so much the better, but it's extra tough in those environments. And when you talk about a military, like a literal military use case,
Hmm.
in US military, they talk about DDIL environments, which is denied, degraded, intermittent, and low bandwidth
Hmm.
environments. So
Yes.
in short, like sort of disconnected or
Yeah.
poor. All those situations really prioritize doing things at the edge if you can, but it
Hmm.
requires a very clean hygiene around how you sync up, right? How you sort of
Right.
reconcile all the differences when you do have connection. Um,
We did an episode with Paul Bastian and Christian Borman on OAuth status list, and it's their solution to revocation. It's more efficient than CRLs for X509 certificate. Everything would be, but yeah, but
yeah.
and that's part of. I wonder that might actually lead into. Oh no, I'll bring that back in number 4. Um, this one is actually how I got started in this whole thing. For the 2 meetings I attended of the Auth working group, I immediately started to feel bristle when it seemed like the subject of the token was always like an entity, like a person or a workload. Um, and my feeling is that most of the decisions that you need, you need actually more than one subject to make the decision. So if you're a bank and you have a bank app, you might want to say, well, this API that we publish is only callable by the bank apps that we've verified, not by a third party app. Even if the person's authorized to call this API, it's so part of our challenges is maybe we need a Boolean operation to combine the principles in a way that we can say, well, if the person's allowed, but the app isn't allowed, that means that we're not going to allow. But yeah.
I see a comment coming in about the federation bubbles concept that Justin Richer introduced around DDIL environments, which is interesting. So that maybe has a role to play in talking about how you interpret a bundle of tokens, right? Like how far does the trust framework extend across them, and that could determine sort of the Boolean allowance of which
Mm,
tokens in which state. But I
right.
also feel like, you're starting to talk about multiple, okay, potentially entities with identities in a token or in a set of tokens, in a bundle of tokens, which,
Right. And remember, the tokens might have different issuers. So we might have an attestation from Google that the app hasn't been modified and that the device isn't rooted. We might have an attestation from the authenticator about, and then we might have some attestation or some assertions from an identity provider. So the potentially this bundle of tokens has multiple issuers too.
there's a potential cost, by the way, that comes with that, where it really does militate for um, doing as much on the edge or sort of pre-baked as possible. Because I'm thinking of the UMA experience, designing UMA, where we added an entire entity to the servers involved, where you break apart the resource server and the authorization server,
Hmm.
and imagining an interaction where the resource owner is trying to put together, kind of an aggregation of all of their resources across resource servers. If it's across resource servers and you have to keep on onboarding to the authorization server every time, that's one thing. If they only work with different authorization servers, now you're into kind of abstraction hell. And so
Federation.
anything that you have to do kind of at runtime regarding multiple issuers is going to be very expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. And I think developers are generally good at dealing with one issue, and you throw multiple issuers at them, and it just makes it even
Yeah,
harder.
yeah. I mean, that's where we start seeing what we would call, humanitarians would call a narrow ecosystem, where for simplification of any one real deployment, you're going to look for single issuer stuff. And that might defeat some of the purpose. So it's something to look out for.
Yeah. So as tokens provide this correlation key between the entities. So if you have a token, you can say, oh, this was a token issued to a specific workload acting on behalf of this person, and this workload is associated with this organization. And so I feel like the tokens provide sort of the way that you thread together when you're building your cryptographic chain of custody, the way that you thread together how these things fit together and drill down on it.
I'm going to bring up the R word here, relationships, or maybe it's the re word because people call it RBAC. This is one of the things that got me excited about it, thinking ahead was, this model more naturally accommodates multiple entities and opens up the possibility of incorporating really important context, which you can use for decision making, including authorization, around relationships. So if you can start to have an explicit relationship model around, the tokens that you get in your bundle, then a whole bunch of, additional or kind of epiphenomenal information becomes available to you. And to Kevin's point in the comment that's come in, yes, I mean, I see all decision making that happens with identity in the mix, with human identity in the mix, but with a lot of other things in the mix as well. I see decision making as including authorization and access control, but in a SIAM context, it could very well be about, the market facing elements of the proposition, upsell and all that stuff, personalization.
What was that word you used?
Epiphenomenal. It's one of my favorite words. All right. What I mean is it arises, it wasn't there in the beginning, and it's just a consequence of the phenomenon, but it didn't directly come from the phenomenon.
Okay. Well, I was an English major in college, but you're sending me to the
Quickly checking.
This is one of one of the key advantages, I think, which is that we're inventing all these new tokens, and the tokens are hard to validate. And actually validating X509 is a pain in the neck. One of the reasons that we're so happy with all this new tooling like Spiffy is it's making things like MTLS easier, because X509 stuff's also not easy. Anyone who's suffered with a OSPF or all of these other protocols for revocation.
OSCP, yeah.
OSF, I'm sorry, right? Yeah, I'm forgetting, which I think is maybe a good thing. But we have access tokens, we have ID tokens, we have transaction tokens, we have new verifiable credentials. And it's like, yes, you need to validate the signatures. That's hard, but you also need to understand the contents. They have expirations, they have NBF, not before. They have other claims that the subject is only maybe you only want an assertion with a client who's been authenticated, so you have to check the audience. So there's all sorts of things you might have to do to validate the contents of these tokens that developers are relying on the libraries to do, but the library might or might not actually do it. And then finally, we have revocation, getting back to revocation again. So there is a way to validate JWT tokens and X509 certificates, but this is a draft. Developers aren't doing it today. But I feel like we need to offload this stuff. We need the developers to obtain the right tokens, but then once they obtain the tokens, I feel like the security team needs to say, okay, in order for us to do this, here's the evidence that you need to present. in tokens in order to be allowed to do this action on this resource.
Yeah, I think there's an incremental opportunity or benefit here. This kind of thinking could sort of smooth the pipeline of new token semantics creation by maybe making us focus even more on how to optimize the infrastructure of tokens so that developers can do all the stuff that we want them to do for security, for safety, for hygiene, about things like revocation, about things like, well, how do you add semantics? What if we wanted there to be more tokens covering a new area, containing more different kinds of data? We want developers to feel like they can participate in that ecosystem of creation.
Yeah, I'll go to my slide
Sorry.
10, or my point 10. And the orders of these, I think, was not particularly well prioritized.
You never know.
But yeah, so the schema creation, in these B2B sharing ecosystems like iShare, each ecosystem comes up with its own schema. We were also had a side conversation on LinkedIn about delegation, and we have a future episode with George Fletcher coming up on delegation. But yeah, I do feel like, is this what you were saying though? How the developers can actually extend and use these tokens more effectively, or were you saying something else?
I was saying, well, maybe two things. One is make sure that there's enough infrastructure and the tuned infrastructure to enable usage, sort of better consumption and ingestion of tokens that are out
Mhm.
there, because you're saying that there's barriers, and I think that's true.
Yeah,
And
we'll get
then
back to that
also to
point.
have creation of new token types where that's warranted be more participated in. And the signs will be there if we're all successful and we like this idea and we pursue these things, we'll see more tokens created without more burden created for anybody, more
Yeah.
token types,
You
more
know,
schemas.
I see transaction tokens as a very generic container where perhaps we can leave it up to the developers to define the schema in that container, what's in that transaction, without having to invent new tokens. That's one of the things I really like about that spec, because they don't tell you what's in. They tell you there's certain things like we're not going to reinvent expiration or NBF, but then what actually goes in that transaction token, what goes in the payload, even access tokens to a certain extent. You
For
can put
sure.
anything in them, really.
Oh, they are definitely, all of the standards around this are absolutely, token type generators. They're not really token types as much. There's a little bit of
Hmm.
infrastructure. And the tendency in standardization, as you saw with authzen, I think is reasonably around kind of lazy evaluation of what semantics are needed, because you kind of want to be able to see how people are going to use it and then responsibly kind of standardize. And I think there's
Yeah,
definitely a place for that.
and without that, it's hard to get interoperability.
I mean, that's why we saw, there's so many OAuth based profiles that are within enterprises that are unique. Like that's a fine use of it. It's sort of profiled for deployment within that organization and not necessarily profiled for everybody to use. But eventually, if something's good enough and widely applicable enough, it gets known and it can be standardized.
Right. And yeah, and OpenID, by the way, did a great job. Um, OpenID Connect standardizing some of what the data that was in those payloads, not just the fact that you're sending an authentication request, but
Yes,
what are
the
the parameters
claims.
of that, and what are the values of those parameters mean. So
Yes, that was very bold, and to go down to like identity claims, an ID token, you know, there was at least a decade plus of consternation around how do we standardize anything like a schema, right?
yeah,
And it's
well,
good to
that
have
part is
the
not
the
my
base
favorite
11.
part. Especially like there's no way to reference like given name, like is that section 1.1.2? It's like, so yeah, it wasn't perfect, but I mean the more about the authentic, like prompt
Yeah,
equals login, like the data login.
yeah,
That's
yeah. The
actually,
yeah,
and
that's more the
some of the other.
infrastructure. Yeah.
So one thing I feel is that when you talk to developers about how to actually do this stuff, like role-based access makes sense to them. They're like, okay, I'm going to define roles in my application, and then I'm going to map my permission somehow to these roles. And so I think that it makes sense. That model makes sense to them, and I feel like we can go to developers and say and explain TBAC to them, and just say, look, you're going to define what are the possible actions and resources in your application, and we're going to basically say what tokens are required to perform those actions. So I think this is the theory where the rubber needs to meet the road, because TBAC doesn't exist yet. But I think it's something that we can explain to developers. Whereas other like policy-based access control seems like more like a meta framework for governance, or relationship-based access control. It's fine, but it's yeah, I feel like it's not as general purpose, or as potentially easily put to work by developers. And then
Yeah,
if you
I
agree
mean,
or disagree,
basically,
yeah.
I agree. That's always been, I would say, the subtlety around anything in our, voluminous identity standards world is we tend to over rotate on, how it appears from sort of the IDP side, how it appears from the authorization server side, and we sort of forget about app owners.
Hmm.
And so I think your sensitivity to what makes sense here should be paid attention to.
We'll see. Um, Policy should be managed like code. So one of the hardest issues that I think something like TBAC will raise is how to govern these policies. And that's where you might need a framework like PBAC, because ultimately these are just all policies, and you need a way to manage your RBAC, your ABAC, your RBAC, your TBAC, and your other policies. So I still think these are policy governance frameworks are useful. But we've been converting all the glue apps to use Cedarling. So we've sort of been like, we're going to eat our own dog food and actually see how this goes. But the application developers are in a good position to know what are the security sort of like, dials in their application. And so I think they're well positioned to be a part of how these policies um, are needed, or which policies are needed. Um, and that these policies, but then we want them to be reviewable and governable. Um, but ultimately, when the policies go into the app, they should align with a certain version. We should know this is policy version whatever, and it's been code reviewed by this many people, by the security department and the application developers. Um, but I think it's a fine line, because I don't want the policies as code. I don't want them in a programming language, and I don't want if-thens built into the code. But I want them
Mhm.
managed. I think you could say that this sort of fits in with the general cloud native strategy around declarative syntax. I want them managed like code, but I don't want them to be code.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like I was going to answer with yes, and maybe a better way to say it is um, the actual goals that we have. This is jobs to be done thinking is, look, I want the artifacts of policies to be just as versionable and auditable as everything else in a kind of cloud native view of the world. Um, at the same time, some of the most important contributors to what the policy should be are not developers.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they're, product managers or business analysts or even auditors, or, they're coming from a kind of compliance oriented view of the world. There's kind of a stack of what even policy means. Operational policy of an organization is another meaning of policy that's different from authorization policies that I've run into a lot, for example, in the healthcare world. Um, we need to have inputs from all the right people, and we need to distract the techies with shiny objects if they're not part of that conversation. The shiny object should be that it is, just kind of like config as code. It's like, well, you want to know what you deployed at any one point, and you want to know when you turned it off and turned something else on. You want to be able to do deltas, and so that managed like code, I agree with for all of those reasons, but the reasons are what's important.
Yeah, and I think we want to be able to change the policies. So if the CISO sees a policy and says, "Oh no, this has got to change," it has to be changed. The change still needs to be QA'd because it is, but the code itself doesn't need to be changed by changing the policies. So we're separating, but it doesn't mean that just because it's not code, that we still don't have to QA the app, because you could, the security is so important to the behavior. Yeah. Let's see. So this one, this is the one I get the most pushback on from the rest of the world. And because there's a large part of the world that just has this view that the PDP must be connected to a database to get all that other information it doesn't have access to in order to make a decision. And my first reaction is, well, there can be different types of PDPs. If you can afford that type of latency, maybe you can have a network connected PDP that's connected to a database. But what I see is that, for all the applications, especially at the edge, but also applications that need really high performance, we really want them to have all the data that they need right there to make a decision. So we can do sub-millisecond decisions. Ideally, like maybe even 20 decisions per millisecond, and without having the data already ready, you can't actually, once you add in a round trip, whether that's to a database or over the network, you've just killed your performance. So if you need that data from the central database, either the application should obtain it ahead of time, or it should be baked into a token. And so I see companies needing to get, a lot of times I feel like they want to work around the IDP because their IDP doesn't do what they want. But I feel like enterprises need to get better at knowing how they're going to enrich these tokens and send them out to applications so the application has the information it needs.
I kind of feel like it all depends on what is the volatility, again, time to live strategy around the data that you're getting from different kinds of tokens. Like if it's behavioral biometrics cues that are coming from in session, like what if they're continuous? Like those sorts of things are perfectly presented at the edge. But if there's things that are kind of long running that might have come from some central source, well, maybe they can be packaged up and provided, but like the multi-issuer question comes in again. Like, what's the cost of going and assembling all of the things into the bundle in order to have enough context for a PDP to make a decision? So I kind of feel like different deployments are going to need a mix, depending on what the quality of the data that they could get from a centralized strategy versus an edge strategy.
And nothing says the application can't call APIs, and because the tokens are the subject or principal, but the application is still going to submit the context, the resource, and nothing says that the application can't go out and do some of those in order to prepare to enable the PDP to make that decision. Like,
but will
is a
it want to
subscription
make
active or
5 or
not?
10 or 20 calls in order to assemble that bundle? Like that imposes a different kind of cost, right? It's very chatty. So there's trade-offs everywhere. It might be that that's the right answer for some kind of application, particularly if it's providing its own, I don't know, software statement and attestation of something, things it already knows, or things that it's fed in some sort of passive fashion. These are the things I'd love to know how it's going to go in the near future, when we get better at this.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what are the use cases where having a JWT as the PIT absolutely won't work, or X509 certificate, which somebody in the chat mentioned are harder to extend, which is true. Although I guess you could probably do it in the SAN. Maybe there's probably some way to hack it.
I mean, this is where, things that are not impossible, but are just hard to do and have been barriers. Well, maybe we can make it easier in the new world.
Let's see. This is the last one technically. Okay, this is, Reiner Horba is going to do another PAM session with me. We did a PAM session and I was completely dismissive of PAM systems. I'm like, PAM systems are an admission that we failed.
Yeah, but remember, like, enterprise password management Like there's a
Yes.
lot of tactical solutions out there that goodness knows we needed at the time, and they've sort of turned into, like, now password managers are turning into secrets managers for all sizes of entity, and like
This is sort of
I'm
my
not
theory
opposed.
about PAM, is that you have a bunch of one-offs and you build a PAM one-off which bundles those one-offs. So then now it's PAM is better because you're not having to manage Active Directory and this other thing again. So your PAM system's doing it for you. But by definition, each PAM system is a collection of one-offs. Some are good at SSH, some are good at Windows, some are good at cloud. And having them for the enterprise is better because at least you have one PAM system instead of 5 one-offs. Um, but still, my theory here is that the PAM systems themselves should be clients of TBAC. That
Mm,
that we need to extend this authorization mechanism so we can manage the policies for these PAM systems in the same way, and we don't have these one-offs for these very pragmatic reasons, like you're mentioning.
yeah. And honestly, in cloud native environments, what you might call PAM really just looks like managing privileges of everybody. So
Hmm.
it's sort of disappearing in that context. So it is kind of dissolving. I don't know. I'm put in mind of, I can provide a link to folks. Dave Birch had this post about clipper ships as a kind of tactical solution to the new ships that were, competing across the seas. And yeah, they didn't really survive, but they were needed for a short time.
They were green,
Yeah,
very low
that's
carbon
true.
emissions.
That's true.
Um, I think that is it. That's my top 10 because we already talked about delegation. This schema thing, we're having a long conversation with this. Oh no, we lost Eve. Right, here she is.
Yes, still
And you're
here.
back. uh,
That was.
Nothing phases us in Identity office hours. Yeah, the schema thing is really critical because, like, I don't think that any ecosystem will ever invent a schema. In fact, when I see the AMR definitions in OpenID, I'm like, haven't we decided that we can't define what MFA is or what even any of these words mean? Um,
Hasn't
but
stopped us.
Yeah, wasn't there an Oasis like effort to try and build standards for what we call these different authentication things, but then they couldn't get any agreement?
Well, SAML has this humongous list of authentication types that I don't know if it's really used today entirely, but there was this whole system, including futuristic authentication, which is now used.
Yes, everything's futuristic for SAML.
Then again,
Um,
my very first standardized SGML DTD effort schema that I participated in, we were defining video and audio clips before HTML existed in anticipation of those being able to be put into online documentation, or rather CD-ROM documentation. So, sometimes good ideas from the future come around.
yes, it all comes back. Okay, so now I'm going to put you on the spot. Token-based access control, is it the future?
Um, Honestly, I became way more enthusiastic way faster than I thought I would upon first hearing about the idea. So I'm going to say yes. It is. It is
Yay.
the future. It is the future out of the multiverse that we are going to live in.
Eve, are you going to EIC this year?
I am going to EIC.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So
And
yes, I'll be preparing slides at some point in a presentation on this topic.
I
So
will be there if I can. I'll be talking about the stakeholder problem in identity, and presenting a Venn diagram of great complexity in the opening night. So hope to see lots of folks there.
well, I very much appreciate the feedback. Before we break, we'll go to the pigeon background. Do you have any last thoughts?
I mean, just to tell people a little bit more about the Venn Factory thing. I hope you'll visit me at venfactory.com. We do strategic advisory. We help people find their hidden differentiators if they're doing anything identity centered. Um, we do speaking. I've got some things coming real soon that look like online courses to help you find and act on your hidden differentiators. So I hope people visit there, and I'll see you over there.
Okay. 4 minutes and 44 minutes, 41 seconds. We're right on time. I'll just announce, I don't know if any of you remember, but the education sort of higher ed space has been doing a lot of work in micro-credentials and credentials. And I'm doing a follow-up episode on that on Thursday. And
Cool.
yeah, and they've sort of adopted they've sort of adopted the verifiable credential framework, and we're just going to check in with them and see what's happening, because everyone would be able to love to present their college certificate as like a verifiable credential, maybe one day. And with that, I'll just say thanks, audience. Thanks, Eve, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.